Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. You know, it's the end of summer. Baseball's winding down to the fall classic. The leaves are going to start changing. And I'm going to ask you what's new and exciting in your world this week.
Economists are kind of like undertakers in the time of plague. When things are bad, all of a sudden we have interesting things to talk about. And so too here. Several listeners wrote this week asking about the price controls Hawaii's officials are imposing in the wake of the wildfires there. Prices rise in the wake of any supply shock, whether it's a natural disaster like a hurricane or a flood, or self-created shocks like with the mandatory shutdowns. The price increases aren't due to greed or opportunism or capitalism. They're due to the fact that there's unexpectedly a lot less stuff available than what people want. Some businesses may be quite happy that they can raise their prices, but that's an effect, it's not the cause. The cause is the fact that there's now less stuff than there was before.
The thing that people always miss, Ant, is that the businesses have to pay more to get the stuff.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We see the gas station charging $10 for gas, and we say, well, he only paid $3 for it, and now he's going to charge $10. What we're missing is he's got to pay $10 to get more gas. What you're left with is this problem that attempting to fight rising prices with price controls simply exchanges high prices for shortages. Instead of the gas station having gas available at a high price or the grocery store having food available at a high price, the gas stations have no gas and the stores have no food. And sure, the prices are low, but low prices don't mean much if there's nothing for sale at those low prices.
You will ration with time or you will ration with money, but you will ration.
Yeah, and some people might respond there that maybe that's a fair trade-off, that shortages are better than high prices. But consider, shortages mean that people have to spend a lot more time searching for things they need. And once they find them, they've got to wait in line, sometimes for hours in the case of gasoline or water. And then often when you finally get to the front of the line, you find out that the store is now out of the thing you're looking for. But it's here in times of devastation that people actually have the least time to waste. You need to find family members. You need to secure shelter, gather your belongings, tend to the sick and needy. Price controls turn high prices into shortages at precisely the point that people don't have the time to deal with shortages. Now, you might ask, why do policymakers keep turning to price controls?
Because they can.
Well, it's more than they can.
No, it makes them look good. They're doing something. Everybody wants to do something.
Yeah, and I think there are two things at play here. One is politicians feel that they need to be seen to be doing something. And so they impose price controls and get shortages in their place. But then the next thing's also important. People tend not to blame the shortages on the politicians. They blame the shortage on the disaster. Well, of course there's a shortage because there's a disaster. And so what happens is politicians can, in effect, do nothing and yet appear to be doing something.
Which is the absolute winning boys magic for a politician. I want to bring our attention back to pop culture. Friend of the podcast and our friend, Christopher Wilcox, posted something on his Facebook wall maybe 2 days ago that really caught my attention. It's a music video by a guy named Oliver Antony. He's really pissed off. The song is called Rich Men North of Richmond. He says, we got folks in the street ain't got nothing to eat and the obese milking welfare. So, of course, all the people who saw this immediately said, fat shaming, fat shaming. And to add good measure, he goes on, well, God, if you're 5'3" and you're 300 pounds, taxes ought not to pay for your bags of fudge rounds. Okay, maybe that's a little mean-spirited, but the entire rest of the song is an anti-government screed, the likes of which I haven't heard since the 1960s. This man is angry. And here's the thing. Nobody's really heard of this guy. He plays at a farmer's market in North Carolina and apparently was losing a battle to alcohol up until about a month ago. As people losing that battle often do, he started praying and asked for God to show him a way out. And don't you know, a month later, a radio station got in touch and asked him to maybe record a song for them. He recorded this song, and in 5 days, it's got 10 million views.
Oh my God, 10 million in 5 days.
And I'm here to tell you, this song is capturing something. You don't catch lightning in a bottle this way unless you're telling people what they already know to be true. There is an anger here, the likes of which I haven't heard in a long time, and it's caught people's attention, and it's caught it hard. And this isn't an established star. This isn't Taylor Swift coming out and saying something that all of her fans can jump on. This is something that has tapped a vein. I would recommend that a lot of people start paying a lot of attention to this, because I think what we're seeing here is the beginning of movement. We'll leave the link to the song in the show notes for you. I'd like to hear what you've got to say about it over on Backstage. Weigh in on it. I don't know exactly what I think. I just know that I'm sensing a different level of anger, and it's resonating. And it's resonating with a class of people that the political class very typically ignores. This brings us, of course, to the foolishness of the week. And I'm going to bring us to San Francisco, California. It's not for the people pooping on the sidewalks. It's not for the politics. It's for self-driving cars.
What's wrong with the self-driving cars?
Nothing, except now self-driving cars are being used as taxis.
So the taxi drivers are not happy.
No, but the customers really are, because they're having sex in the back seats of these cars. Because of course they are.
Let me get this straight. They're self-driving, so there is no driver. Purely autonomous. I didn't know the technology was that good.
A bunch of people in San Francisco did.
All right.
The question I've got for you is just the common sense question. You want to sit in that seat next? Yeah. And that's the foolishness of the week, ladies and gentlemen.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. Mike Semanchik is managing attorney at the California Innocence Project, a nonprofit dedicated to freeing the wrongfully imprisoned and to reforming the criminal justice system to reduce the likelihood of wrongful convictions. Mike earned his JD from California Western and his undergraduate degree in economics from Duquesne University, where I am proud to say he was one of my students. Mike, welcome to Words and Numbers.
Thank you so much for having me. Just to go back, I left most recently the California Innocence Project. I'm now the executive director of the Innocence Center, which does exactly all the things that the California Innocence Project does, but on a national level.
Mike, what was the motivation to jump?
A number of things, but one particular thing is wanting to expand on the impact we've been able to have in Southern California and take it to a greater scale. A couple of examples. First of all, there are 66 innocence organizations around the country and the world. There are still a number of states, I think 10, that don't have innocence organizations as of yet. And there's not really great coverage if an innocent person were to try to get representation in those states. So part of the impetus is let's try to help all of those individuals that don't have access to pro bono legal services in those individual states. And at the California Innocence Project, I was geographically limited to Southern California.
Sure. What's your caseload on the one hand? How many cases are you actively working? And how many attorneys do you have on the other?
Great question. So I'll talk about how it worked in California because we're still kind of building stuff out at the Innocence Center. But at the California Innocence Project, at the height when the prison population was in excess of 200,000, we would get about 2,500 requests for assistance annually, and those were new requests every year. Of that, I would say about half off the top we would just not look at in any way because they were requesting assistance for things we didn't do, things that had stuff not to do with innocence. Or they were convicted outside of Southern California, or they were no longer incarcerated. So a big chunk of those were people incarcerated claiming innocence. As we've halved our prison population in California, we have seen those numbers come down as you would expect. So I think over the last year, we had about 850 new requests for assistance. Of that, we're actively investigating about 160, and then in active litigation in about 50 to 60 of those cases. As far as the staff size, we were at our biggest, we were at a staff of 12, and then towards the tail end, we were about a staff of 7 in terms of lawyers. If the California Innocence Project could have housed it, I think it could have used 24 lawyers to work on the number of cases that were coming in. It was just a matter of resources.
What prompts this interview is a picture you posted on social media. You're standing next to a man who I presume had been wrongfully imprisoned, was just let out, and the picture appears to be of the two of you in the prison parking lot. So I would imagine this is just seconds after he's been physically released. It was so poignant. I mean, to the point that I immediately got onto email and say, hey, let's talk about this. And of course, it hits you viscerally. But going to the numbers, how much of this sort of thing that you get wrongful imprisonment, first off, what's the magnitude of it? And secondly, how much is due to honest mistakes versus negligence versus actual criminal action?
Thankfully, there's the National Exoneration Registry, which keeps track of each and every one of these cases going back to 1989. Any of your current students or future students looking to find some data, I've got just the place for you. You can Google Exoneration Registry, and it's all there for you. Since 1989, there have been 3,352 exonerations in the United States, just in that time frame. And what's great about the registry is they actually break it down and give you what the contributing factors were for what caused the wrongful conviction. And there's some great folks over there that are diving into each and every one of these cases, pulling out the contributions, and then plugging it into their database so we can look at the data and really get a great picture as to why these things happen. The case that you mentioned is it's a photograph of Horace Roberts. He was arrested in 1998 for a murder, and I got him out in 2018. He spent 20 and a half years in prison for the murder. And the true perpetrators, the real murderers, are actually now pending trial in Riverside County. And so they'll probably go to trial in January of 2024. But as you look at the numbers, there's some interesting things, I think, that pop out to me. First, the highest contributing factor is official misconduct, and that's 1,991 cases.
Really? That's the highest contributing factor?
Yes.
Wow.
And when I got into this, when you look just at a finite set of the data, the DNA cases, one of the leading contributing factors there was eyewitness misidentification. So when I was starting out, before the registry existed, that's kind of what we thought. Like, oh, these are all just, the majority, greater than 70%, are eyewitness misidentification cases. And then the registry started documenting and going through all of these old cases and pulled out the numbers. It turns out that official misconduct is more than half. They define it because, definitions are important, as I know you know. Official misconduct on the website is defined as police, prosecutors, or other government officials that abused authority or judicial process in a manner that contributed to the conviction. To unpack that, I think it's police officers that either unknowingly or knowingly push an investigation in particular fashion. In some awful cases, they hide evidence of innocence or evidence that might point to a third-party suspect. Maybe they don't know that it's for sure, but they kind of bury some stuff. Or it's prosecutors doing similar stuff. We've seen a number of prosecutors in the United States. I say a number, I think I can fit them all on two hands, that have actually faced some criminal repercussions for some of the wrongdoing they've done. But the vast majority kind of go without really much happening to them. That's kind of baked into the system. We have absolute immunity for prosecutors in the United States, and we have qualified immunity for police officers. So even when you have bad actors, and I think this is probably one of the reasons this happens, you have bad actors, you can't get rid of them. There's not much you can do about it. Qualified immunity and absolute immunity is almost impossible for civil law to step in and correct things. And really what would happen is, I would think, if you didn't have absolute immunity, counties and jurisdictions would have to have insurance policies to cover their employees for their wrongdoing, and perhaps insurance companies could do a better job policing the police and policing the prosecutors to make sure the bad apples are no longer involved in the process.
That model sounds strange until you realize it's precisely the model we use to weed out bad actors in the medical community.
Yeah. I mean, I have a hard time coming up with other examples where you're not held responsible for your actions. This is one has grave consequences because the harm will continue, and it's great harm.
Let me go back to the gentleman in the picture, Horace
Roberts.
He's in jail, wrongfully convicted. He's in jail for 20 years plus. Was he offered any recompense for that, or did they just open the door and say good luck?
So in California, and every state's different, in California we have a law that gives any person that gets a finding of factual innocence from a court, you automatically get, it's approximately $50,000 a year for every year you spend in wrongfully. I think there's 32 or 34 states that have these compensation statutes on the books, and then the rest do not. And they vary as far as how much money you get. Some cap it. I think initially, actually, California's first compensation bill, it was capped at $10,000. So you prove that you were innocent, you get 10 grand. This is a lot better, and I think we've made a lot of progress and have one of the better compensation statutes. And we've expanded beyond just money, because when you get out after 20 years, money isn't going to solve all your problems. And so we've got free, you can get into a state university. You can get some assistance with housing for a certain number of months. They assist you in getting your driver's license and give you Medi-Cal so you have insurance when you get out. All things that, truthfully, unless you've been down this road with one of your clients, you don't really think about. Like, how are they going to go get a driver's license? They haven't had ID. They don't know where their social security card is.
Right.
They don't know where any of their documentation is. How do you get them back into a functioning member of society? And then, there's other stuff too that's like the emotional and psychological trauma that comes with spending 2 decades in prison. You've lived a different life in a different world for so long that getting back to a regular life is a very difficult thing.
It's heartening to hear this. James and I frequently beat on California for their stupid policies, but this actually sounds great. With one thing that bothers me, that you take someone like Horace Roberts, who's in jail for 20 plus years, let him out, $50,000 per year recompense, someone's going to cut him a check for $1 million. You just drop a check of $1 million on anybody, let alone someone who's spent the last 20 years in jail, and they're going to make horrible decisions with this. Is there any kind of financial education that goes along with that?
It's sad to say that the financial education typically comes from the lawyer that's assigned to the case. So in his case, I've got him access to a financial advisor immediately and said, you are 60 years old. I don't know if you plan on working again. And I don't know that you'll ever... Let's just plan this is the only amount of money you're going to see for the rest of your life.
Right.
What's that going to look like? How do we want to, thankfully for him, he was moving back to the East Coast where houses are a lot cheaper, and this amount of money would mean a lot more to him. He could do a lot more with it. And so in his particular situation, it's worked out fairly well, but there's countless other people that get, it's like winning the lottery, and you haven't had access to any of these great things for decades. And so you get out and immediately you're buying cars and throwing parties and taking lavish trips. And it doesn't last that long. $1 million can go pretty quick, especially when you're living kind of this extravagant lifestyle because you think you're good to go. But not having that financial education and background is not. It's a disservice. So it's a challenge, though, because at the same time, you want to give them financial freedom to do what they want.
I don't want to get too bogged down in the numbers, but now that you're talking about it, I'm kind of interested. What about Social Security benefits? They're indexed to how much you earn during your working career. And Horace hasn't had a working career. What happens there?
That's a great question, and one I don't have an answer for. But it should be that he shouldn't be held to that. And I'll say this, too. Federally, we had a bill pass, I want to say it was 2015 maybe, where it became law federally that if you were to get compensation for your wrongful conviction, that you would not have to pay tax on it. And so there is no federal income tax requirement on the $1 million, which is fantastic. Why should the government be able to take a portion of your award funds for the harm the government did to you?
Antony says he doesn't want to get bogged down in the numbers, but of course he does. That's all he wants to do.
Yes.
I want to ask a rather different kind of question, and I'm afraid I already know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do any of these people on the prosecutorial side, do they ever look at their victims in these cases and apparently feel any remorse? Do they ever seem to feel badly about what they have done? Do they ever offer to make amends in any way?
Some do, and some don't. In the Horace Roberts case, the elected prosecutor apologized to Horace. Really, it was a heartfelt apology. And the line prosecutor that prosecuted the case also expressed his heartfelt apology for me to convey to Horace. Horace didn't really have an interest in speaking to the prosecutor that prosecuted him.
Can't say I blame Horace at all.
But there's others that don't. I mean, we had a case in San Diego, the Uriah Courtney case, where the line prosecutor, still to this day, I think, thinks Uriah did it. And in Uriah's cases, I mean, we have DNA in a couple of different places from the victim's clothing that connected the case to a registered sex offender who went on to commit more crimes in the state of Washington. And yet, even with this powerful DNA evidence and this fantastic third-party suspect that lived in the area and was known for pursuing victims of this type, and despite all of this super strong evidence, the line prosecutor still believed that we must have done something nefarious, like planted the DNA evidence. I must have gone and obtained some third-party suspect's DNA, broken into the evidence room and sprinkled it all on the evidence. And, like, these are the kinds of theories that are going through this line prosecutor's head. And never an apology, never any kind of anything towards Uriah from the line prosecutor. Now, the elected prosecutor, totally different story. A heartfelt apology and really just hoping and wishing that Uriah can go and live his life to the best of his ability. I think it just kind of depends.
Well, it's kind of heartbreaking when you think about 20 years lost, but the kinds of questions that Antony asks, well, okay, it's 20 years lost, but what kind of years are left?
Right, and try to put it into perspective. When Horace went to prison, he had 3 kids, twins that were 7 years old. When he got out, they were 27. He went in, he was like 40 or 41. I think he was 40. He got out, he was just about 61. So some of like the pivotal years for spending time with your kids and watching them grow, he had to do from afar, from a prison cell.
And we're talking just about Horace here. I mean, his family,
Right.
Those kids are growing up without a father, single mother.
Right.
They went through, in their own way, their own hell because of this.
Definitely.
We've gotten into a lot here, and it's actually made me very sad, and it's made me very angry. I can only imagine what your job is on a daily basis, trying to contend with these sorts of emotions, and yet you've got a job to do, and that job requires the support of others. How do you get the support of others? Where does the money come from?
Great question. That tees it up perfectly for me to say, go to the innocencecenter.org, make a donation. We've got PayPal set up. The funding for these types of organizations comes from the government. They have a couple of grant programs that allow us to do some of the work, but also from private citizens. And really what we've seen is that as the funding has increased and the organizations have grown, the rate of exonerations per year has grown, as to be expected. We were at the tip of the iceberg in the early 2000s and even into the 2010s. And now we're just starting to see this rate is accelerating at a faster and faster pace, to the point where I think last year was the most number of exonerations in the history of the United States. I think from 2015 on, we've broken a record every year.
Now, that's an interesting thing to underline.
Yeah.
Because you said originally, 3,000 exonerations countrywide. And of course, that's not per year, that's in total.
Right.
And someone can look at that and say, yeah, but that's a small percentage of total convictions in the country. But if you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg, does anybody have any estimate as to how many are out there?
There's been a couple of studies done. There's one study that came out that the conclusion was roughly 4% of all death penalty cases in the United States are wrongful convictions. Unpack that. If you're thinking about a death penalty case, typically death penalty cases have the best prosecutors, the best investigators, the best defense attorneys. Typically well-seasoned judges are overseeing those cases. They have the best review on appeal. Mm-hmm. They get guaranteed, for the most part, federal appeal. So they're going to see the most sets of eyes and the best sets of eyes.
And yeah, nearly limitless budgets.
Right. And it's a 4% error rate. So what's it look like if it's not a death case, right? My estimate personally is I think it's probably somewhere for the serious and violent felonies. So we're talking murders and rapes. It's somewhere between 5 and 10%.
Wow.
As you move away from the serious and violent and you get to more junior prosecutors and junior defense attorneys and new investigators, it's higher. It's a number and it's a problem we probably won't ever be able to really address because the sentence and the punishment goes down as well. So by the time I would get to the point where I'm ready to investigate a case, that person's probably already home.
Yeah.
So we're never going to be able to fully recognize how big the problem is at the lower levels. But I would think 5 to 10%. So just in California alone, 100,000 people in prison, 10% is 10,000 people currently sitting in prison for something they didn't do.
I was looking through the California Innocence Project's website and ran across a description of what the website describes as 3 major errors in police questioning. And I won't read the whole thing, but roughly speaking, the officer decides that the innocent person is guilty and so now interprets answers to questions in that light. The person's subjected to the mental fatigue of being questioned over a long period and just will say whatever to get it over with. And after the person admits guilt, the police then help to create a narrative of the crime that includes facts that only an innocent person would know.
Only a guilty person would know.
What struck me as interesting about those 3 errors, I teach students how to conduct consumer sentiment surveys, where you go out and you're asking people about a product. What do you think about this brand of pop or whatever it is, right? In the Principles 101 level, these are things to watch out for that you don't contaminate the data that's coming back in. And this is just asking people, what's your favorite brand of pop, let alone ask, did you murder somebody? This is astounding.
Yeah. If you put the numbers of false confessions to what you're talking about, there's been 414 false confessions since 1989, which accounts for just shy of 12% of the total in the exoneration registry. How could 414 people falsely confess to a crime they didn't commit? It's a hard thing to grasp and understand until you've done what you've done, which is figure out what are the police doing and what might be the end result. And so there's commonplace reforms that we can institute to correct these things. First of all, make it more of an open-ended conversation where it's an interview. You're there to gather information. Keep the accusations aside. Gather information, and then ultimately it's that information you're going to want to use down the road. 2, always record interrogations, because a lot of times what will happen is a police officer or an investigator might introduce information only a guilty person would know. And then later down the road, some hours later, this suspect repeats it back. And they say, oh, well, the guilty person is the only person that could have known that. Well, you introduced it in the first place. You just forgot about it. So we need to have it recorded so that we can see what happened. And that happens quite often. And then just the way that you go about it is always confrontational. You go into an interview or an interrogation room, and it's set up in such a way to make you feel like you're not free to leave. They close the door behind you. They make it uncomfortable. They often will have power moves where there's 2 against 1, and they'll set up the room in such a way that it looks like they mean business and try to mentally encourage you to say the things that need to be said. One of the major problems, and this is completely okay and legal in the United States, is that law enforcement can lie to anybody that they're interrogating. It's not allowed in the UK or Canada, but we do allow that in the United States. And so if you spend hours and hours talking to somebody, making them feel like they're not free to leave, making them feel like they're not going anywhere until they admit to what they did, and the police start to introduce some lies like, your DNA is under the victim's fingernails. We know you did the murder. That might be complete lie, made up. Mm-hmm. Your fingerprints at the scene, complete lie, made up. Now they start saying like, how did your DNA get there? Maybe you just forgot. And slowly but surely, you wear a person down to the point where they're, okay, maybe I did do it and I just don't remember. I must have had like this blacked out session, and next thing you know, you have a false confession.
This is like a flashing neon billboard. Never, ever, ever to talk to the police.
Bingo.
If they are so persuasive that they can talk an innocent person into declaring his guilt for a crime, you'd have to be out of your mind to sit down unrepresented at a table across from the police.
I want my lawyer now. Those are the words you use.
You started off by saying something fascinating that I parsed as we think of the police as being investigators, as seeking truth. They aren't seeking truth. They're seeking a conviction.
Correct.
They're actually working for the prosecution.
They're part of the government team. There's been a lot of work over the last decade or two to make it so that public defenders get paid on par with what prosecutors make, so that at least we have a level playing field when we step into court. But it's still not level, because the government still has this entire wing of the police force that does all of the investigation. You get one little investigator from your public defender's office that does a couple of interviews and tries to poke holes in what this big bad government has done in advance. They also run all the crime labs.
Right, yeah.
There are private crime labs that you can go and get testing done, but not to the extent that the Department of Justice has. They control CODIS, having access to the national database of all of the DNA samples of all of the offenders. Only law enforcement can access that. So here's this big government, and here's this little public defender's office with a handful of investigators and some experts that they typically hire. And that's typically what you're up against.
We don't talk a lot about inequality on Words and Numbers, but this is one place where it just screams out at me that the person, the citizen who's going to survive this encounter is going to be someone who's better educated and has financial resources. People who are less educated without the financial resources, they're toast.
There's been studies done. You're much more likely to have a better result if you spend your time not in jail pending trial, but at home, on home confinement or out on bail or whatever. Those that have access to the resources to get out on bail have an ability to assist in their defense, and it makes a world of difference.
I guess I've got the big picture question, right? The one that we're always left with. What are we supposed to do? It's clear that we've got a problem, and it's clear that that problem is an order of magnitude bigger than most reasonable people think it is. And when we think about this idea that 10 or 100 or 1,000, pick the number you like, guilty people should go free lest one innocent man go to jail, well, clearly we're violating whatever number we're going to pick. Mm-hmm. And that's demoralizing.
I would start with getting rid of absolute immunity and qualified immunity, put some teeth behind it, actually hold people accountable for their wrongdoing. And then we can start to actually fix one of the biggest problems that we see, government misconduct. We've gone to a system that's almost entirely plea deals. It's not contemplated in the Constitution. It's not even mentioned. Jury trials are.
Clark Neely comes on from time to time, and one of the things that always flies out of his mouth is we have to stop charge stacking.
Yes, and that's exactly where I was going, which is you have somebody that's facing, like Brian Banks was, 41 years to life for a crime, and he's innocent. But here's this sweet little deal we're going to dangle over here that says if you just come and plead guilty, then maybe you'll go home today, maybe you'll get 18 months, maybe you'll go to prison for 5 years. But it won't be 41 to life. And in California, in 2003, 41 to life was life. You were never getting out. So of course you're feeling that pressure. And as a 16-year-old kid, he chose door number one, which is plea deal. Having the opportunity to get in front of a jury and cross-examine and confront the witnesses against you is a very important thing, and one the founders believed strongly in. But more than that even is, I don't know how often you all are serving on juries, but what I do know is, yes, the idea is a jury of your peers, but when there's information that's presented to a jury that most jurors are not going to be able to comprehend and understand, how can we expect them to make a decision that's going to impact somebody's life? And an example might be, say there's this medical theory called shaken baby syndrome. And the theory is that you shake a baby so much that it causes this triad of symptoms. And say a couple of medical doctors get up on the stand and they testify about this triad of symptoms, this very complicated medical evidence that jurors are now supposed to understand and put trust and credibility into whatever expert they decide. Ultimately, they have to make a decision. Well, the vast majority of jurors are never going to fully comprehend and understand what's going on with the medical technology and the medical evidence. And they're just going to say, oh, this guy sounds more credible than the other person that's taking the stand. We now know that shaken baby syndrome is complete bullshit. That of the thousands of cases that have been looked at, short falls, where a kid falls from 2 to 3 feet, say on playground equipment, and they hit their head, it's those same 3 things that was introduced in the triad cases that happen from short falls. And kids fall all the time. In some rare circumstances, a kid falls, hits their head, they end up dying, and they die with this triad of symptoms. how is a juror ever supposed to know that shortfalls could have caused that? Even at this point, when I'm looking at these cases, how am I supposed to explain this to a judge who has no medical background and prove to them that, look, this is a diagnosis that was flawed. There was circular reasoning involved in the theory behind shaken baby syndrome. And we have this person sitting in prison for decades for the death of their child, which is an entirely additional awful aspect of these types of cases. I don't know that there's a solution to the jury issue, but relying on 12 people that don't have potentially the education necessary to make these decisions that impact an individual's life, it was probably a lot simpler in the 1790s to put a jury on and say, okay, this is how it broke out. Today, I'm not sure that we have the capability to maintain this jury system if we go from plea deals back to juries and still be able to respect the result. I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I don't know what to do.
James mentioned charge stacking, which we haven't defined for the audience.
Yeah.
But you talked about the kid facing 41 to life. Mm-hmm. So charge stacking, correct me if I'm wrong, is the prosecutor not only charges the kid with whatever the original crime was, but a whole bunch of other things precisely to get that number up to 41 to life.
Correct.
So the kid is more likely to accept the deal.
That's exactly what it is. So now you're facing this insanely harsh penalty, and you have to try to make a decision what to do.
Mike, this has been wonderful. Now, you have a podcast. Do you want to push it?
Yes, if you want to learn more about any of these issues, false confessions, eyewitness misidentifications, DNA, I have a podcast. It's produced by Legal Talk Network, and it's living on their website or anywhere you get your podcasts. It's called the California Innocence Project Podcast. We dive into all of these things, and I also spend quite a bit of time allowing the exonerated people to tell their stories. So please tune in and send me your comments, thoughts, and I'm happy to talk to you all about these issues.
Can I look forward to having you on again down the road?
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to coming back.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.